Okay, so thank you so much, and Taylor, and thanks for this invitation to be part of this seminar series, which I think is absolutely fantastic. As we were just discussing before we started the seminar, scale is just so fundamental across so many applications. So I think it's a really excellent development. So I'm really excited to be part of it. And thanks also for your patience in trying to find a time that suited us across all these multiple time zones. And it's great as well to be able to join in. I mean, there are very few positives that we can take from the last year and a half, but I think one of those is certainly the inclusivity that this has promoted in terms of who can present and who can join in as well. So thanks again. So I've listed my contact details at the bottom of the screen if anyone wants to get in touch afterwards, but I should say that most of this work is co-authored. And I'll be sure to kind of highlight who I've been collaborating with and where you can find some more information on the things that I'm going to present today. So just so you know where I'm going then with this, what I want to do is to provide a kind of overview of the spatial scale dynamics of intergroup mixing, of diversity and of segregation in Britain. The accent that you're listening to at the moment is a Belfast one. So I'm from Northern Ireland and sitting in Northern Ireland right now. This is Queen's University in the background, the image that you see behind, although I haven't been on campus in quite some time. What I'm focusing on today, or where I'm focusing on, is mainly Great Britain. And so by that I mean England, Wales and Scotland, mostly discussing England actually, where the highest by far levels of ethnic diversity can be found. So I'm not being very loyal by not including Northern Ireland, which is part of the wider, of course, UK, largely given data comparability issues and the considerably lower, albeit increasing levels of ethnic diversity that we have in Northern Ireland. So I want to start by providing a kind of overview of what I'm calling the microgeographies, the very fine scaled geographies of ethnic diversity and of segregation in Britain. And I'm doing that across a fairly long time period, right back to 1971, actually. So we have 40 years of comparison. And I'm going to explore a particular data resource that's really useful for looking at spatial scale and the dynamics of spatial scale in relation to ethnic diversity. I'm kind of breaking the rules with this presentation in that there are several stories that I'm going to present and several main sort of takeaway points. And it's an accumulation of several articles actually as well. So I hope I'll be okay for time. But what I was trying to do with that is to really respond to the theme of the seminar series around scale and kind of cherry pick, if you like, the elements of my work that have really focused particularly on scale dynamics. So after that, I'm going to explore a little bit in more detail the most highly ethnically diverse neighbourhoods that we find in England, what we call multi-ethnic neighbourhoods, and then think and reflect a little bit on the increasing spatial complexity of ethnic and residential geographies in Britain and the implications of that for understanding scale and the kind of urgent attention that scale dynamics need. So the first section of the presentation draws on work that's fairly recently published in spatial demography, and that's collaboration with my colleague Chris Lloyd, who's also at Queen's Geography as well, and also very into spatial scale and all things scale. That paper is part of a wider spatial issue actually in spatial demography that aims to explore fine scale data in modelling, in particular, migrant settlement patterns across Europe. So that might actually be of interest to some of the audience today, just to highlight that, that special issue that was just out before Christmas there. So what we've been doing in this is looking at ethnic diversity and segregation at a greater spatial and temporal in greater spatial and temporal detail than previous studies have done, particularly in the UK context. But actually, we argue that taking this longer term perspective is actually fairly unusual across studies of ethnic diversity and segregation globally, really, actually. So as I'll say in more detail, we're looking at using 1 by 1 kilometre grid cells and a specific resource that we created as part of a wider project to look at how diversity has changed over a 40-year period. So it's an innovative and actually freely available resource called PopChange, which I'll introduce in just a moment. But before that, just to kind of as a lead in to some of this analysis, I mean, I'm talking to a convinced audience, I guess, but I just want to emphasize a few particular points in relation to the need to think about scale in relation to some of these themes. And as we know, analyses of neighbourhood change are often subject to compromises around the size of spatial units and, of course, temporal inconsistencies in their boundaries. So if we want to look at change over time, we often encounter some barriers to that and some compromises that we have to make. What we argue in this article that that's a particular issue for ethnic and racial studies, because spatial patterns, so ethnic residential geographies, and changes to them are often highly localized. Okay, so we see very distinctive local patterns at a very small spatial scale. And that means that those inconsistencies in, for example, boundary changes in boundaries have particular implications for the nature of this sort of study. And actually, the scholarly literature emphasizes the importance of small scale patterns and processes in understanding the drivers and the resultant patterns of ethnic demographic change. But we'd argue actually hasn't always attended to that in the ways that we might be able to. And that was one of the sort of gaps that we're trying to think a little bit about in this article. And actually, when we go back several decades, Vaughan Robinson, writing in 1992, just after the first time the UK census asked a question on ethnic group in 1991, argued that the micro-scale geographies of immigrant settlement is distinctive even between streets. So there's this very small spatial scale differently connected. So as I was saying, back in 1992, writing just after the first census, the first time that an ethnic group question was asked in the census in the UK, Vaughan Robinson acknowledged these kind of micro-scale geographies of immigrant settlement and argued that those were distinctive even between streets. So he argued that really attention needed to be paid to these changes at not just the neighbourhood level, but actually, at the finest grain possible to really understand the extent to which, in particular, urban environments were changing. Now, as we know, administrative changes in the size and the shape of spatial units used to report data from censuses, and it's the case in the US as well as the UK, are implemented to respond to local level population growth or decline. And of course, that creates a particular issue for us as analysts of neighbourhood change, in that zones are then inconsistent between time points, and we need to think of a way of standardizing those if we want to analyze neighbourhoods over time. Most approaches, by far the most common solution to that is to transfer population data from zones at one or more time point to make them consistent with typically the most recent set of zones. So for example, taking 1991 census data and using 2011 boundaries to explore change over time. And so that means that the results for earlier time points are actually based on zones designed with a different population structure to when the data were gathered. Now, that solution is actually logical and very commonly applied. I've done that a lot in my own work on ethnicity, and it's used a lot in deprivation analyses, for example. But what we argue in this article is that population grids offer an important alternative solution to this approach, where we base our analyses on the population structure for a single time point. And what we argue is that actually population grids are arguably a more natural way of representing populations than, for example, census wards or tracts. Now, that is not to say that we should throw those away and not use them ever again, but I think for issues around scale and thinking about these microgeographies, then grid cells offer a really exciting alternative. And here are some of the reasons why. The first is that there can be holes where there are no people. So basically using grids allows us to have gaps where the population is non-existent. And that's really particularly useful for studies of ethnic segregation, as you can imagine, because what we're trying to do in studies of segregation is understand, appropriately the spatial configuration of a population and really understand where people are. So an example I have actually used a little bit, included a little bit on Northern Ireland here, and this is a map of Northern Ireland. That very, very dark area that you can see to the east is Belfast. So that's a much more densely populated area than the rest of Northern Ireland, as you can see. But these are actually grid cells, and grids are a kind of standard census output in Northern Ireland, but not for the rest of the UK. So part of this wider project, which I'll discuss in more depth in a moment, was actually to create something like this for all the standard census variables to enable this comparison over time. So the point of this is just to show, you can see some of these white spaces, for example, in South Down, in the north of Antrim, and in some parts of the west of Northern Ireland as well. Those are mountainous or highly rural areas where literally nobody lives. And as you can see, if we were using a more standard census output like super output areas, for example, we would have data for people for that wider zone, which, you know, would actually misrepresent the population in that case, because obviously no one's living at the top of Slieve Donard, for example, in the Mourne Mountains. So grids are useful because they allow for these holes. And standard spatial units, of course, cover the whole study area, assuming then, you know, that boundaries between adjacent zones are actually neighbours, but in practice, of course, that might not be the case. So population centres in neighbouring zones might well be distant from one another and not located to their zone boundary, which actually might exaggerate the capacity for interaction between people in those adjacent zones, which is a kind of related advantage to population grids, whereby the distribution of people within standard zones can be taken into account. Another advantage in relation to scale is that the spatial scale of observation is constant across all areas. So from the most densely populated urban areas to the most sparsely populated rural areas. And that, again, we argue is particularly important for studies of segregation, because the zones are of constant size, and that provides a logical base for comparisons between areas, given that likely interactions are, we would argue, impacted more by distance than by population density. I'm sorry if I'm going, I hope I'm not going too fast. I'm trying to make up for the lost time of that connection, so I'll maybe try and slow down a little bit. Another kind of point about grid cells is that they subdivide larger areas with lower population densities. So countrywide statistics based on grids emphasize, relative to standard zones, locations with lower population densities. And again, if we think about ethnic diversity, that's potentially really important and significant, because it removes that urban bias to which most analyses of standard zones are fall prey to. Which again, I'll focus on in a few more slides after this one, where what we see really is this spreading out of ethnic diversity and growth of ethnic diversity, yes, in urban areas, but also in suburban and rural areas too. So this is becoming increasingly important. And this kind of response to this urban bias, and the fact that grid squares allow us to explore more appropriately areas with lower population densities is actually becoming all the more urgent, really. Okay, so in short, grids we think offer some exciting possibilities for understanding the changing geographies of ethnic diversity, which are, as I've just mentioned, spreading out. The box that you should be able to see in the bottom right-hand side just gives some further information on the grid square resource on which we draw our analyses. And this is freely available. I'll show you how to find the data if it's something that's of interest. Of course, it's for Britain, but there's some really interesting things that could be done around spatial scale using the data resource. So as I've already mentioned, these are 1 by 1 kilometer grid squares. They report data on a whole host of demographic and socioeconomic variables from the census. Relevant to this presentation, there's information there on country of birth, right back from 1971 when the resource starts, and ethnic group from 1991 when the ethnic group question was first introduced in the census. And they have a mean population of about 250, and that's obviously grown just slightly over time. Now, I don't have time to go into this in any kind of detail, but we did have to, it's just worth bearing in mind, we had to go through some pretty intense decision making around the variable choices, particularly around country of birth, because as you can imagine, exploring change over time right back from 1971 introduces a whole pile of different issues in terms of inconsistencies in how countries are reported, and so we had to think very carefully about some of that in the ways in which we could standardize country of birth. And again, if you're interested in that, it's all there in the paper. So our data set enables us to make a few claims to novelty. Because pop change provides consistent data for the whole of Great Britain, we're actually able to explore the rapidly shifting ethnic geographies of Scotland, which has received considerably less attention than the rest of Britain, largely given issues of data comparability, but also given its comparatively lower levels of ethnic diversity, albeit they're really rapidly increasing in some areas anyway. And our analytical strategy is quite novel, not just in making use of grids, which have, I should note, have been growing in popularity, and there are some really interesting and really important studies out there making use of grids, but also in the way that we apply a suite of methods in their analysis to explore diversity and segregation over time. And this includes variograms, which is a method rarely applied in population studies, which in this paper we use to provide a quantitative summary of the spatial extent of diversity and how that's changed over a long period. And I think in terms of scale, it's a really interesting application. So I will provide some information on that in due course. So just to quickly say, there's the resource. If you just even Google pop change, you'll find it. You do have to register with an email address, and then the data are all yours to play with. The project was funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and there is a kind of supportive paper in Computers, Environment and Urban Systems describing the resource as well. The map to the right then is actually something called the Townsend score, which for some people will be possibly familiar. It's a kind of a composite measure of deprivation, and that's shown for 2011. The only reason I'm highlighting that is there is a map of Great Britain, which you'll be seeing quite a few of over the next number of minutes. So if your geography of the UK is as needing as unadvanced, let's say, as mine is of the US. And I'm just going to give you a little hint. I'm sorry to anyone to whom this is very obvious, but in the very north, we've got Scotland. And then to the west, not the very toe, if you like, of Great Britain, that's Cornwall down there, but the kind of sticky outy bit just above, just to the north of that is Wales, okay? And then the rest of that is England, okay? I could have provided a map with labels, but I thought most of us probably don't need that. There's an insert in there for London as well, because a lot of the action, as you can imagine, takes place in London in terms of ethnic diversity. Okay, so just as a little bit of context, and I will skip over this fairly quickly, we're really excited about the fact that pop change allows us to look at small area change for such a long time period. And, you know, across a period that has seen massive changes in the demography of the UK. Our story starts in 1971, as I've said, and that's a period when we just had the cessation of the immigration boom of the Windrush generation. We were seeing new layers of so-called not white diversity layered on existing and new flows from Ireland and the rest of Europe. And migration largely for reasons of labour, for family reunification and for education as well. And as you can imagine, there was an urban bias to that immigration settlement, particularly in London. We also then, of course, had further immigration and then natural change, the growth of populations through the balance of births over deaths, which accounted for the composition and the growth of that diversity. Internal migration within the country has also been really important as a mechanism for reproducing the spatial patterns and the kind of changing geographies of diversity. And there has been a lot of interest in the changing geographies of racially minoritized populations in the UK, in academic quarters, but also in public and policy debate as well, as you can imagine. And yet there's been no kind of what we call an atlas, if you like, of change over small areas over a longer period. And so we're using the pop change resource to think about the spatial scales of diversity on a consistent basis. and asking questions around what we can learn about the changing microgeographies of ethnicity from what we've termed a longitudinal study of small areas, and asking questions about how diversity has evolved within and between areas and over what scales from the local to the regional. We also, you can use the resource to answer interesting questions like which period saw the most marked changes in diversity and segregation. In other words, when has Britain's neighbourhood change been at its most dynamic? So as a kind of way in to the grid squares, because I appreciate they're kind of, they're an unusual thing to look at. I think 1 by 1 kilometres is very small. So we're not used to seeing such high spatial variability, I think, in maps of population distributions and in change as well. But what we're looking at here are just simply percentages of one country of birth group, and that is India. So in the very left map, this is the proportion of people in each grid square who were born outside of the UK and who were born in India. And on the very right, the same, but for 2011. And the map in the middle shows the change between 1971 and 2011. So the changes that produce that final map, if you like, on the right-hand side. And I think it's just useful to start with something as simple as this, because what we can see is the very intricate spatial detail that the gridded data unlock. So if we think back to that comment, that quote from Vaughan Robinson, these kind of, we're not quite looking at streets here, but we're looking at the most intricate kind of changes that we could observe at a sort of country level, really. So just as a bit of context then, Indian settlement in the UK has been traditionally concentrated in London and in the Midlands. So you can see that kind of pocket of red and orange towards the sort of middle of England there. And also a little bit in the northwest of England, I think you can see. So relatively higher levels of Indian born people in the northwest of England as well. And of course, those broad regional patterns that are well known can be seen in those maps, but actually the microgeographies of growth are also clearly discernible, particularly for London, and helped with that inset as well. And they do reveal much more than data at a lower spatial resolution. So while family and labour-related migration drew Indian migrants to the UK, it was to very particular parts of cities, to neighbourhoods and to streets that were transformed by these migrations. And so there are lots of interesting stories behind these maps related to subsequent immigration, to family building, that resulted in the growth in the kind of settlement areas, if you like, that can be identified in the map for 1971. But these kind of new pockets of Indian communities, particularly around the mid and north of England, and I think that's most obvious if you look at the change map in the middle, actually. And those are likely, I mean, we're not looking at processes here behind those patterns, but from what we know from other studies that we've done and others, that's partly due to socio-spatial mobility away from those settlement areas, and also new immigration flows, and in particular by students. So we have quite a high intake into higher education institutions in the UK from India. So that is the story for just one country of birth group. But what we're interested in particular is diversity, so the multiplicity of groups. And to capture that, we're using a really fairly simple measure, actually something fairly intuitive, which is the reciprocal diversity index. And some of you might be very familiar with this. It's an entropy measure that's very easy to calculate, but also very intuitive to interpret as well. And basically, it's constrained to range between 0 and 1, with a large RDI, reciprocal diversity index value, in a given grid square indicating higher levels of ethnic diversity. So that is a sort of spread of members of multiple countries of origin or multiple ethnic groups, depending on what we're using here, country of birth or ethnic group. So if we had a value of 1, which in practice is never really going to happen, but if we had a value of 1, that would indicate a sort of even spread of all groups. So if you imagine, for example, a case of 5 ethnic groups, that would mean that each group would, a value of 1 would relate to each group comprising 20% of the total of that grid square, obviously. So a relatively high RDI value can be taken then as an indicator of greater intergroup mixing, because it represents the presence of several or more ethnic groups. And we can actually just look at some interesting trends, even just looking at the median, for example, country of birth RDI values. You can see there, starting from a very low base in 1971 and increasing fairly markedly up to 2011. Now that's the median, so the values are actually still very small because we've so many rural areas with very low levels of ethnic diversity, of course. But interestingly, you know, and one thing I should say, actually, sorry, this is for country of birth, and then you can see underneath, I'm looking at that middle text there, the median ethnic group RDI values as well. Remember that country of birth captures the diversity of countries of origin, okay? And I think that's something important to emphasize before I show you the maps in the next slide. This includes, therefore, recent immigrants, but also people who made their home in Britain many decades ago, including before our study began, so people for whom most of their lives have been spent in the UK. And so the mechanisms that kind of shape the changing geography of diversity that we're about to observe are a combination of new immigration, of emigration, of migration within the country, and then of course of natural change, that kind of balance between fertility and mortality. What we see then, just if you look at the last sentence there, what we had a look at was we tried to understand when the most kind of dynamic period of change was. When was it that diversity kind of changed the most, according to these grid cell analyses? And out of all of this sort of time periods, 2001 to 2011 was by far the most dynamic. 65% of grid cells changed the most in terms of their diversity levels between 2001 and 2011. And the second most dynamic period was actually at the start of our study period, 1971 to 1981. But that was considerably less dynamic, so 19% of grid cells changed the most during that period. And you know, that in itself is actually quite interesting, and it's something that we'll pick up on a little bit in terms of the variogram analysis. But you know, that kind of most dynamic period of change between 2001 and 2011 has been shaped by continued immigration, including via an increasingly international higher education sector, but also through the dispersal of long-established families into new, previously less diverse suburban and rural locales. And that's something that I really want to think about a little bit through this presentation, those kind of new diversities that are emerging. Right, a lot of maps. What we're looking at here is the 6 small maps, or that entropy value, that RDI, for country of birth. We'll ignore the one on the right-hand side just for the moment. And those are the maps just for each of the census, so it's each of the time periods in this pop change resource, so 1971 through to 2011. And then the last one there is the change between those time periods as well. So the dark red indicates higher levels of diversity, and really actually very high levels of diversity in some cases. And orange and yellow, again, moderate to high levels of diversity, with the lowest levels of diversity depicted in blue and green, or actually decreases in diversity in the case of the change map, although that's relatively a rare occurrence. So the first map, the top left one for 1971, shows the landscape of diversity, which, you know, at this point in time had been mainly shaped by immigrant settlement and some familial growth. And we can see London in that insert. And of course, that London is a hub and always has been, always will be a hub for new arrivals. And of course, shows the great ethnic diversity, as you won't be surprised to hear. Birmingham, which is another little pocket of red that you can see in the kind of Midlands in England there, kind of exhibits more modest but still discernible diversity. And if you follow those maps across time, you can see that popping out more and more. But also, likewise, you can see smaller pockets of diversity emerging in the north of England by 1981, and then by 1991, much more convincingly. And then by 2001, we find a geography of ethnic diversity that is the outcome of population growth and, of course, internal migration movement within the country. But as we know from our previous slide, the next 10 years we're really to see a significant further growth of ethnic diversity across Great Britain. And the 2011 map that yields provides a lens into the most diverse small areas of all the maps. And if we concentrate on those dark red areas, those with an RDI value of greater than 0.5, we can, of course, see a distinct bias towards towns and cities, with London, of course, home to the most diverse neighbourhoods by far. But, that spills over London's borders, and we see Birmingham as home to a cluster of high diversity as well. And actually a sort of a growth of diversity in other major cities. And again, without a sort of map to show you where I mean, there's Manchester, Leicester, Nottingham and Bradford popping out there as well. Considerably lower levels of diversity in Scotland and Wales, but there is absolutely a growth in diversity in those locales. It isn't helped that the scales and and the legend there are kind of the ranges, if you like, of the data are the same across all the maps. We miss a lot of that kind of dynamic growth that we've seen outside of England. And just one other thing I want to highlight is the change map, which is characterized, we'd argue, not only by growth of diversity, but an increased spatial intricacy of diversity. So we're seeing new spaces of diversity emerging and a more kind of complex landscape of mixedness. In other words, more grid cells are diverse than ever before, and diversity is reaching new corners of Britain outside of major urban areas. And that is something that we really wanted to focus on with this. Okay, so we'll move on. Right, so this is some interesting scale stuff that I think, hopefully will be of interest to everyone here today. And again, I'm sorry, but I'll just have to try and speed up a little bit because there's some good things I want to say about scale. So those diversity maps that we had a look at reveal this kind of spreading out of ethnic diversity from urban areas that I've been talking about. And we've seen, of course, relatively high levels of diversity for some spaces across all time points, as you'd imagine, but actually a growth as well in some suburban and rural areas as well. So the countryside, if you like, less urban areas are seeing this growth in diversity. And those trends reflect the changing spatial scales of diversity, which we argue in this article has received considerably less attention than the scales of residential segregation. So there's a really great body of research looking at the spatial scale of residential segregation, but actually diversity, with some notable and really important exceptions, has definitely received less attention. And so we wanted to do something a little bit different to make use of the grid cells and exploit their properties for being able to think a little bit about the changing spatial scales of diversity. And that was to use variograms, which are very uncommon in the social sciences and in population studies. The reason that we were kind of turned on to these was because my co-author has a background in geostatistics where these are used much more commonly. And actually we're really excited about the potential of variograms for exploring spatial scale. And there are multiple applications that this could actually be used for. Now, it is not my area. Obviously diversity is, but variograms are not. So I'll explain how they're computed and what they show us. Any of the complicated questions I'll have to gather up and send to my co-author. But this is, I think, something I really wanted just to explore, given the nature of who is here today and the interest in scale. So variograms are really interesting because they can be used to capture the scale and also the magnitude or the variance of diversity. And they're actually computed quite simply. So what you do is you compare each, in this case, grid cell, to all grid cells which are 1 kilometer away, for example, and then you would compute half the average squared difference of those grid cells. Then you would do the same for 2 kilometers. So you would increase that to 2 kilometers and again compute the half the average squared difference. And then you would go and do that the same for 3, 4, 5 kilometers. Then you would plot those values, and that's what you're looking at on the y-axis there, the semi-variance, and plot those against the distances, which you see on the x-axis. Okay, so what does that tell you? The maximum semi-variance, so the largest value that you can read off that y-axis, is equivalent to the variance. In essence, larger values indicate larger differences in RDI or in diversity values across the country. So that's one thing that you need to look at. The second is the break of slope. Now, I haven't highlighted on the graph because it can just get a little bit confusing because there's a different break of slope for every time point. Okay, so we're plotting these for 1971 through to 2011. So as you can see, there are 5 slopes there. So the break of the slope distance, which is in variogram language called the range, tells us about the scale of variation. So a much shorter distance, so a shorter break of slope, a slope that would break closer to the y-axis, if you like, indicates that local level differences are dominant, whereas larger differences would indicate that region-wide differences are most notable. Okay, so there are a few things that we can take from this specific graph. I think it's just worth talking through step by step. The variograms for 1971, 1981, and 1991, which you can see at the bottom of the graph, all, as you can see, have very similar forms. Okay, so the slope looks very similar, in other words. Whereas in contrast, the variogram for 2011, as you can see, if you look at the next line up, has a larger maximum value, and for 2011, a larger value still. The range values also increased between 1991 and 2001, and then again between 2001 and 2011. So what this shows us is that the spatial scale of diversity was relatively consistent between 1971 and 1991, but it had increased between 1991 and 2001, with the largest increase, as you can see quite clearly, I think, between 2001 and 2011. And the increasing maximum semi-variance values, okay, so reading off the y-axis, indicate an increase in the differences between highly diverse urban areas and elsewhere, and reflect that kind of moving of diversity from urban cores to suburban areas. Now, it would be very hard to quantify those scale differences in cartographic form. So the maps I just showed you reveal that spreading out of diversity, but don't actually provide us with that kind of quantification of the scale of diversity. And what this, I think these variograms quite clearly show, is this kind of increased momentum in the growth of diversity. And there's just the kind of difference in that rate of change, very particularly between 91 and 01, but also even more so between 01 and 11. And that's quite interesting in terms of the segregation literature. I don't know how familiar our audience today is with the segregation literature, but there have been ways of approaching kind of this idea of the spatial scale of segregation, how it's changed over time. We think variograms offer an alternative perspective to those existing measures, which are based on computing, say, indices for a set of different geographic bandwidths. And the sort of specific scales of variation can be identified with these variograms, which are possibly a more effective summary than looking at, for example, ratios between measures of two discrete bandwidths, which is commonly used in segregation analysis, and actually which I'll do a little bit of towards the end of the presentation. So population grids, we think, offer particular advantages in the exploration of spatial scale because the units are of equal size. So it's relatively easy to analyze these changes by spatial scale. And I just wanted to kind of exhibit that as a potentially useful tool for exploring spatial scale. I'm going to skip over this summary. What I wanted to do next was actually to explore in more depth high diversity. The most diverse neighborhoods that we find in the country. I think I don't have time, and that's a real shame, but it probably responds less to the discussion around scale specifically. And so if I may, I'm going to move on, but if you're interested, and hope you are, I really love this paper. It's just come out in Transactions, and with my colleagues, Richard Wright, who's at Dartmouth College, and Mark Ellis at UW, where we really think more closely about multi-ethnic residential neighbourhoods or high diversity residential neighbourhoods. And think a bit about the stability of multi-ethnic residential neighbourhoods, which, again, as I wanted to kind of comment on, because multi-ethnic residential neighbourhoods in the US have been shown to actually be relatively unstable. So, for example, between 2000 and 2010, less than 50% of neighbourhoods classified as high diversity in 2000 retained that high diversity status by 2010. Whereas in England, what we see is less than 5% did not retain their high diversity status between 2001 and 2011. So some really fascinating things in there about the retention of diversity and its stability, which I thought might be quite interesting. So, I mean, maybe that's an avenue for future questions, but I'll skip over those slides if I can, and excuse me for doing that. So I'm sorry, but the interruption to our internet connection has made time rather more pressured than would have been ideal. Okay, so I'm going to focus on this because there is a real sort of scale story here before I conclude. And again, it's drawn on a relatively recent publication, well, a few years ago now, 2018, where I think about scale dependency again in the British case. Okay, so as I've mentioned several times, urban diversity is by far the dominant pattern across the UK, and of course in the US as well, and elsewhere, for example, in Western Europe. But suburban and rural areas are experiencing a modest but steady growth of racially minoritized populations. And Daniel Lichter has been quite core in kind of identifying that for the US. But I argue in this article that the segregation literature has actually not kept pace with migration scholars who have been dealing with, for example, suburbanization and counter-urbanization and changing rural populations for decades and doing it really successfully. But the segregation literature isn't quite so interested in non-urban environments for obvious reasons, because as I've just shown you, diversity is obviously a much more kind of metropolitan phenomenon. But what I argue here is that we do need to think about this urban-rural spectrum and pay a bit more attention to that changing, those shifting geographies of ethnicity, but also to think a little bit more about small areas within metropolitan areas as well. And I'm just going to quote Daniel Lichter word for word here and colleagues, where they say, to fully understand, in this case, US trends in racial segregation, we must balance the current preoccupation with changing neighbourhood segregation in large cities with new analyses at other geographic levels, including smaller cities and towns outside metropolitan cities and urban areas. So, I mean, there are a whole host of reasons why we might want to do that, but, you know, it is important that, you know, we see this growth of diversity outside of urban neighborhoods, yet because a lot of studies of segregation stop, if you like, at the city boundary, there's a kind of accidental, I think, implication that minority populations outside urban neighbourhoods are a less urgent topic for scholarly investigation. And I think that's something that we really need to pay a lot more attention to. So related to that, I should say, as context, the UK segregation literature has been surprisingly aspatial to date, and or reliant on what we might call superimposed administrative geographic boundaries. Which I would argue have limited or sometimes no resonance with the reality of residential experiences on the ground. Now, again, that's not to say that we shouldn't use those zones, but actually that there are ways of thinking about those more kind of critically for studies of segregation in particular. I'm not thinking so much about diversity here. And again, I'm not sure how much of a background to segregation studies our audience might have, but just to note that most segregation indices, so if you see any articles or presentations that report values around segregation, using, for example, the index of dissimilarity, the index of isolation, report those for example, a city or a country for a specific racial group, and report a kind of one number. And ignore, so they kind of basically treat the edge of administrative zones as hard boundaries and ignore the possibility of interaction across them, which is actually potentially really important. So to respond to that, if you like, we have these spatial measures of segregation, which allow us to incorporate information on populations in neighbouring zones, and local indices, which go further and actually provide us with a value for each individual small zone. So, for example, a census tract, rather than their collective, for example, tracts in a city or something like that. The beauty of those, of course, as you can imagine, is that they're mappable and we can explore the geographic patterning and scale of residential segregation across a study area. So I know I'm rushing through this a little bit, and please forgive me for that. The internet connections throw me a little bit, but I just want to say a couple of points in relation to this. I'll move through this fairly quickly because this is just a little bit of context, but the headline, if you like, is something quite important to bear in mind for the next couple of slides, and indeed the final slides that I have to present. And that is that the spatial lens through which we measure segregation has a profound effect on how we report it. And I was going to just provide you with a little bit of context on what's been done in that regard, but I'm just going to skip over that. And argue that local and spatial measures are really important for overcoming those assumptions made via boundary definitions by allowing us for a more flexible exploration of multi-scale segregation than, for example, a multi-level approach, which still uses predefined administrative boundaries. So, for example, in the British case, output areas nested within lower super output areas nested within districts. So spatial and local measures are computed using distance decay functions, basically, where close by zones have a greater influence in the calculation of the indices than those that are further away. And there are two different ways that we can deal with that. We can use a fixed bandwidth where there's the same neighborhood around each area, regardless of whether that place is urban or rural, or an adaptive bandwidth. And that allows us to account for the scale of segregation because we adapt the distance decay bandwidth and have a small bandwidth in urban areas and a large bandwidth in rural areas. And I've used a mixture here. I'm just going to skip across to show this just in relation to scale before I conclude. Okay, so first of all, using a fixed bandwidth, which is distance, what we can see is what you're looking at basically are two different measures of segregation. So if you look at the legend, D, it relates to the index of dissimilarity, a very commonly applied measure of segregation, and P, the index of isolation for just 4 case study ethnic groups. And on the y-axis, the index, the value for that segregation measure, and along the x-axis, the bandwidth, okay, in kilometers. So basically, in essence, the scales at which segregation can be observed for each ethnic group are explored in, just again, time is skipping on, but what I want to say is basically, first of all, that the scale of segregation varies both within and between ethnic groups. And that's actually something that's really quite important and hasn't been acknowledged particularly well in much of the segregation literature. We can see different values for each ethnic group according to the scale at which segregation is measured, but also for the same ethnic group at different geographic scales. So for both of the dimensions of segregation here, unevenness and exposure, each ethnic group you'll see quite clearly has higher levels of segregation at those kind of small or neighborhood scales and less at the larger or regional scales. Now, that's no surprise that segregation levels are higher in small areas. And we know that, of course, neighborhoods are more likely to share similar population characters than our regions. But the impact of scale isn't uniform for each ethnic group. So if we just have a look at spatial unevenness, those D values of the 4 groups shown, you can see, I think, fairly clearly that the Bangladeshi ethnic group has the highest levels of segregation at the very local level. But that unevenness falls pretty sharply as the neighborhood size increases. And indeed, for this group, they have the most notable difference in segregation levels between small and larger areas. So as this bandwidth increases. So in other words, Bangladeshi segregation levels are high relative to other groups, but those high levels are only very localized. So for a 35-kilometer bandwidth, for example, Bangladeshi segregation is actually lower than for the white British and Indian ethnic groups. And this is really important. So the relative levels of segregation between ethnic groups vary across spatial scales. So a given group might be relatively more unevenly spread than another at one spatial scale, with the order reversed at larger spatial scales. And you can see that sort of flip around between the white British, Indian and Bangladeshi ethnic groups, for example. Now, we might ask, why is that relevant? And again, I could provide a few more examples there of how those sort of patterns change, but just in the interest of time, I want to think about this question. Why would that matter? Why do these spatial skills matter? So in the UK context, the Bangladeshi ethnic group is sort of understood in public and policy narrative as amongst the most segregated of all groups in the UK. And indeed, it's fair to say that the aspatial measures kind of show that, albeit segregation levels have decreased dramatically over time. But in some locales. But these results actually suggest that while those aspatial index values have a role, they don't provide the full picture. And indeed, the Bangladeshi ethnic group has high levels of segregation for only those very small spatial scales and in very concentrated locales, actually primarily in inner London. but much lower segregation levels than for other ethnic groups across larger areas. That not only challenges our understandings of segregation patterns, but actually potentially hints at the reasons behind them. So for the Bangladeshi ethnic group, yes, we have comparatively high levels of segregation at the national level, but those pockets of segregation are small scale and geographically rare. And those localized concentrations can be found pretty much exclusively in areas with a long history of Bangladeshi settlement. For example, Tower Hamlets in East London. And what we might be observing here then is therefore Kerry Peach's good segregation, reflections of strong neighbourhood attachment and belonging, and a kind of, it makes a lot of sense that segregation levels would be higher in those pockets with that long history of settlement, or potentially less positively the outcome of housing pressure and overcrowding, with implications for understanding persistent ethnic inequalities, which of course we know have exacerbated during COVID. So a kind of take-home message from that is that the same data analysed differently, for example, with spatial measures, can actually produce rather different conclusions about the comparative levels of segregation between ethnic groups and how segregation can be understood in specific locales, which is really important issue in the UK context, and indeed in the US context too, given sort of highly politicised debates about the extent of ethnic mixing in an increasingly diverse society. Which kind of challenges established wisdom about the relative levels of neighbourhood mixing between ethnic groups. Now, I did want to say a little bit about sort of cutoffs of segregation and how we could identify operational spaces. I don't have time to do that. I was also going to show you some interesting maps which map the local levels of segregation. And again, time has just not been on side at all. So I'm going to have to move on because I appreciate that this is the middle of the day for many of you, or the start of the day for others. So just to summarize then, what we see are increasingly complex geographies of ethnicity, which are inter and intra-ethnic, inter and intra-neighbourhood, and highly dependent on scale and measurement. And all of those things do not operate independently of each other. And that, I think, calls for more attention to be paid for this spatial variability of diversity and of segregation. We see these kind of differing impacts of scale for each ethnic group that are just not well understood at all. We think about kind of change over time between groups, but we don't think about that variation within groups terribly often. And that the sort of so what of all of that is how and in what ways do those differing residential experiences matter for example, tolerance, inclusion, for inequality, and for opportunities as well. So thank you for listening. I'm so sorry for my connection issues. I'll pop my camera back on in the hope that my connection will stay